Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Before we get started, I want to say something briefly about the announcement by the VA earlier this week in delaying the go-live of the electronic health record project in Spokane, Washington. I've long said that getting it right is far more important than hitting a date on a calendar. And if there needs to be a delay to get the system to a place where veterans' lives are not at risk and the VA staff are ready to use it, then that's the right thing to do. However, I'm concerned that as we've moved closer to the go-live date, we have been told repeatedly that there were no showstoppers in the implementation, that testing was going great and things were on track. I get that in software development and testing, conditions can change rapidly, but I require that the VA be as transparent and accountable for its actions. There's many questions that remain, and the subcommittee needs answers in order to continue its oversight of the $16 billion project, especially as the President's budget proposes a speed up of the rollout. Therefore, the subcommittee will be scheduling a hearing on this topic in the coming weeks and will request to hear from decision makers at the VA. But now on to other aspects of VA's management of its technology portfolio. The Department of Veterans Affairs has long struggled with aging legacy IT systems, and the need to invest in new and innovative technology is necessary if the VA is going to continue delivering quality health care and benefits to our nation's veterans. However, implementing new technology is not simply a matter of buying new software or new tools. The VA must also ensure that its policies and business rules keep pace with the changing technology, and most importantly, ensure that veterans are confident in its ability to protect their highly sensitive information. I acknowledge that this is a difficult task, especially in the rapidly changing technology landscape. In the healthcare sector, the gray space in how we manage, use, and exchange data is growing more quickly than policymakers can keep up, but it's critical that we try. The VA is well situated to be a leader in this space. The Electronic Health Record Modernization Initiative, coupled with this four-year billion-dollar department-wide technology refresh, gives the VA the opportunity to set standards and rules from the outset. These requirements will not only benefit veterans, but might also serve as a nationwide example of balancing privacy with interoperability and big data innovation with confidentiality. Health information and consumer data can be used to great benefit. VA's robust research and innovation programs have the potential to revolutionize care, reach more veterans, engage them in new spaces, and empower them with their own health care. Veterans can use their data to manage their care, find economic opportunity, and access the benefits they've earned. However, these advances are not without risk. The attractiveness of big data for monetary and marketing purposes is clear. In the first half of 2019, nearly 32 million healthcare records were breached. And as we examined at our hearing on cybersecurity issues last October, that data is also attracted to bad actors that may seek to commit crimes or cause harms, as well as companies looking to monetize veterans' health information. We cannot assume that data is safe or secure, nor do we want to keep data static to avoid any risk. However, with the changing technology landscape, we need to be deliberate in our assessment and decisions about how data is used, who gets to access it, where that access occurs, and why. I want to hear from the VA about the process of vetting partners and vendors that participate in technology initiatives or develop apps. It seems to me that when the VA provides an app in its app store or promotes an app, a wearable device, or a medical technology, we expect the VA to assess the value of that technology or the benefit of that app and determine that the benefit out to veterans outweighs the data security and privacy risks. I would like more information from the VA about this process and what it entails. However, there's another critical question. What protections exist or should exist in the space beyond the VA? If a veteran chooses to download health information from the VA and share it with a third party, may that third party use that or sell that information for other purposes? What responsibility does the VA have? I am also concerned about the VA's increasingly widespread use of apps and potential risks to privacy that they pose. When a veteran downloads an app from the VA's app store, how much personal information does the VA receive? What is the process used to determine what is minimally required? In the lead up to this hearing, the subcommittee has studied some of VA's apps. Many require significant elevated permissions and access to a user's data or device. For example, I have a chart behind me that of apps and their permissions. Here we go. The PTSD coach requires full network access, the ability to read all of your contacts, and view any file on your phone. Concussion coach allows access to a user's entire calendar. These permissions may be excessive and unnecessary invasion of a veteran's privacy and may put the veteran at risk for identity theft. Why do these apps need access to location, a user's photos, calendars, contacts, and other information? Are these permissions necessary for its function? And does requiring excessive permissions lower the app usage rates and decrease their efficacy? And speaking with veterans and veteran service organizations, I've heard repeatedly that transparency regarding data is a key concern. Here, we are also concerned about the VA's activity. The privacy policy for ACT coach is 988 words. It's right here in the blue, of legalese with clauses about incidental or consequential damages and a non-exclusive license in consideration of your acceptance. Can we expect anyone to realistically read these and understand their terms? I'd like this to be a conversation where we can assess the data landscape at the VA and in the larger health IT space and understand where protections exist or don't exist and whether we need more guardrails on that data highway. We need to understand if the VA is doing enough to protect veterans' privacy or if more needs to be done. Most importantly, we need to ensure that future decisions on strengthening, keeping, or perhaps even loosening privacy rules are made in an educated manner with input from all stakeholders. Today we have two panels, one with VA officials who are here now, and another with experts from health informatics, technology, startup, and veteran service organization space. I look forward to engaging on these important topics, and I thank all of the witnesses for being here. I would now like to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Banks, to deliver any opening remarks he has.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank all of our witnesses on both panels for joining us here today. This is a distinguished group of VA and private sector data privacy experts. On the other hand, I have to say that I'm extremely disappointed that there is no VA witness here today to discuss electronic health record modernization, especially in light of the department's recent decision to take more time to prepare for the implementation in Spokane. Dr. Rowe, Mr. Watkins, and Mr. Roy and I felt strongly that the Office of EHR Modernization should be represented here today, and we requested a minority witness, which the VA did not provide. I wholeheartedly, though, support Secretary Wilkie's decision to delay. I said in our previous hearing that I was cautiously optimistic that a March 28 go live was still achievable, but developments to the contrary over the last several months are undeniable. I am glad, though, that we will have an opportunity to question VA very soon about how exactly the additional time will be used to make the implementation more effective. Turning to this morning's topic, there was a time when VA was a closed system that could exercise complete control of veterans' personal and health data. Even then, privacy breaches happened. Many of us remember 2007, when a laptop and external hard drive containing 26 million veterans' records were stolen from a VA employee's home. Even though the records were eventually recovered untouched, the incident led to then-Secretary Nicholson's resignation. Today, small-scale privacy breaches are common in VA as elsewhere. They are usually attributed to email phishing scams and careless document handling at individual medical centers. However, VA has not been a closed system for many years. As in sophisticated private sector health systems, personally identifiable information and protected health information are increasingly stored in the cloud and provided to external apps. I want to say up front that I believe the HIPAA privacy rules need an update, and I'm glad to see the Department of Health and Human Services soliciting comments on how best to do it. When the privacy rule was written 20 years ago, there were far fewer entities accessing protected health information. There was a good reason to allow insurance companies and claims processors to access patients' data without written authorization every single time. There is no way our health system could function otherwise. But today, some of HIPAA's permitted purposes to access patients' records when applied in new context may become loopholes. A healthcare provider's business associate agreements with its partners stipulate how patient data will be used, but patients rarely have any idea what those agreements say. Similarly, healthcare providers' notices of their privacy practices are often vague. The health technology landscape is evolving quickly. Mobile apps have already taken over the software marketplace, and in a few years, most health records will be stored in the cloud as well. It would be foolish to resist change and try to return to an earlier technology environment when fewer entities handled protected health information. Privacy safeguards have to evolve as well. As we discussed in our cybersecurity hearing in November, the healthcare sector has become a hacking target somewhat later than other parts of the economy. Unfortunately, for most Americans, personally identifiable information, and often their financial information, has been exposed in a list of data breaches that are too numerous to name. Earlier this week, Attorney General Barr unveiled criminal charges against the perpetrators of the Equifax hack of 145 million Americans' personal information. Unsurprisingly, they were members of the People's Liberation Army. It would be naive to think that China and other nation-state cybercriminals are not already targeting protected health information. Protections for health information must remain strong in the realm of cybersecurity as well as privacy. They can never be allowed to deteriorate, as protections for personally identifiable information clearly have, into a state of widespread vulnerability. The question before us is whether VA has a unique role in protecting health information apart from HIPAA and other laws governing the entire healthcare sector, and apart from HHS. Without a doubt, VA must make smart, strategic decisions with respect to its technology partners. However, I am skeptical that VA can or should drive the regulatory environment unilaterally. I look forward to exploring those issues with our witnesses here today, and with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I will now introduce the witnesses we have on our first panel. Paul Cunningham is the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Information Security, Chief Information Security Officer, and Chief Privacy Officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Cunningham is accompanied by Martha Orr, Deputy CIO for Quality, Performance, and Risk, Office of Information and Technology, and LaShawnae David, Director of Privacy Service, the Office of Information Security. We will now hear the prepared statements from our panel members. Your written statements in full will be included in the hearing record. Without objection, Mr. Cunningham, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the Department of Veterans Affairs' mission to protect personal sensitive information of our nation's veterans. As the VA Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Privacy Officer, I'm pleased to represent the department here today. I'm here with my colleagues, Ms. Martha Orr, Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Office of Quality, Performance, and Risk, or QPR, and Ms. Lashani David, Director of VA Privacy Service. First, I'd like to thank the subcommittee for its continued support of VA and commitment to veterans. Because of your cooperation and commitment, veterans can continue to trust VA to protect and serve their interest. As the Chief Privacy Officer, I lead VA's efforts to secure and protect veterans' personal information. As a veteran, I've seen the value and impact VA has on so many that have faithfully served. We can only provide that value through trust. That's why I'm personally vested in protecting veterans' information from exploitation and misuse. Secretary Robert Wilkie is committed to promoting innovation, transformation, and technology to enhance the veterans' experience. However, large organizations like VA face challenges as they modernize their IT environments. With new technologies come new risks. VA's privacy program must adapt and remain vigilant protectors of veterans' information as an environment of greater and faster access to data emerges. In the course of accessing VA benefits and services, veterans voluntarily share their personal information to the department. To protect this data, VA establishes acceptable use policies, implements security controls, and proposes consequences for any violation of policy or agreement. We follow strict rules governing how the department creates, stores, transfers, and destroys sensitive data. QPR's Enterprise Record Service oversees these activities, and OIS VA Privacy Service helps safeguard that data by partnering with QPR to conduct privacy risk assessments, compliance monitoring of systems that contain personally identifiable information and protected health information. The department also implements a role-based access control system, which means that it only grants access to those who need the information to perform essential job duties or provide benefits or services. Each system is closely evaluated, equipped with appropriate access controls, and monitored for abnormal activity. When data is improperly accessed, VA takes appropriate action to limit further compromise and determine the root cause of the incident. If it's determined that human error or improper behavior is a causal factor, VA will take additional actions, including remedial training or revoking access to the user. VA is expanding access to information for veterans, especially through new digital technologies and platforms. However, ease of access should not mean less privacy or confidentiality. VA only collects information when necessary to provide care and services. VA will never sell or share veterans' information and will only disclose information with veterans' consent or as authorized by law. Violations of these policies will result in consequences from possible dismissal to criminal charges. VA closely guards veterans' information. However, we often must share data with our third-party partners to provide exceptional health care and benefits. In these cases, VA stipulates the term for acceptable use of VA systems and any veteran's information. Our partners must meet these requirements and protect our data as closely as we do. As with any organization that handles sensitive information, there's always risk. This risk can be reduced through effective policies, training, and technical controls. However, these safeguards will not fully prevent an incident from occurring, especially when humans are involved. Should an incident occur, VA will respond to and determine the severity of the incident and be transparent and forthcoming in reporting to Congress. Together, these policies and activities ensure that veterans' information is kept safe on every platform, in every system, and even when shared. With this strategy in place, VA is making sure veterans' information remains safe and secure, which is an important part of the exceptional service that veterans so rightly earned. Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for this opportunity. We're ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Just getting off to start with some background information. Who owns the veterans' data, Mr. Cunningham?
Veterans own the veterans' data. VA is charged with protecting that data in performance of providing the benefits and service under our mission.
Does the VA treat health data differently than benefit or vocational data?
Yes, we do. Personal identifiable information, PII, is protected under the Privacy Act. However, when it comes to medical records or health information, it falls under HIPAA.
Is there a difference between ownership and stewardship of data? And what is that difference?
There is a difference. The difference resides in, at the end of the day, the veteran can decide who has access to that data. For instance, they turn that records over to VA to be custodians. And they also trust that VA is looking out for their interest in deciding who has further access under laws and regulations. So, but however, a veteran can provide consent to other third parties outside of VA's purview to gain access to their information. In some cases, in those cases, we have no real authority or control over that.
Do you have concerns about that? I mean, are there areas along here where you're looking at what the VA can do to make sure that veterans really understand what that means?
Certainly, that's a challenge that we're concerned about. At the end, veterans do not work for VA. It's hard to impose regulations or requirements for them for annual training. We send out notifications, or in our flyers, we give pamphlets when they're visiting our sites and waiting for appointments. There's public announcements that talk about how to protect your data or how you should be concerned. But it's difficult as we across the industry and across the United States to make sure that people really understand when they click an app and accept that app, do they fully understand the full access that they have and how that information is going to be used downstream?
What are the requirements for outside parties to access VA data?
For third parties that are accessing VA data, they must meet the same standard as a VA system. So as they connect to our networks, they also get scanned and checked.
I sent a letter to the VA on January 7th, 2020, asking about the VA's knowledge of the Ascension Health partnership with Google and about how the VA oversees its community care provider, their third-party data sharing. When can I expect a response to that letter?
I'll ask our professional liaison to follow up on that.
Okay. Ms. Orr, what role does the VA have when a third party, whether it's medical device, community partnership, VSO, enters the veteran healthcare space?
The role that the VA would have, I think, goes back to your question about custodian and doing what we can if the data is in our purview to protect it.
And back to you, Mr. Cunningham, what are the VA's policies regarding the monetization of veterans' data by third-party partners?
The department's position is it's not to be sold. Third-party access to our networks, they have to agree to those standards. There are also any sort of contracts that apply, or any sort of contractors applying to our networks or using our network's data, they have to agree to acceptable use, which includes not selling that information.
And does the VA have the capability, technical, organizational capability to monitor compliance with these restrictions? And have there been any examples where there's been a violation of that contractual agreement?
I'm not aware of any instance where we've been informed that a third party has taken VA-managed data and sold it. In cases where, I mean, we certainly review the records and the performance of the contract as it's required in the contract law and the FARs. And if there's an issue it's identified, then appropriate action is taken. But again, I'm not aware of any case where a approved third party has sold VA's information.
But you do have the ability and the technical capability and the organizational capability to monitor monitor this performance for such breaches?
Outside the...
Or is it being told, are you being informed by a veteran who has been like, how do you find out if that's happened?
Well, certainly, if a third party was doing it outside of the contract, or in a lot of cases, a lot of these third parties are healthcare corporations that understand the value of protecting that data. But if that's occurring, they're not informing us, and we're not policing their networks. With that said, if a case does come forward where a individual says their information was sold from a third party that's endorsed by the Veterans Department or Veterans Affairs, I would say that we'll take swift action to investigate it and take appropriate actions accordingly.
Thank you. I'm over my time. I now yield to Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cunningham, I want to return to an issue from our cybersecurity hearing last year. I asked you then whether the VA had ever purchased equipment from a list of Chinese technology companies, and you took those questions back for the record. The VA provided answers from those questions just last week, that based on searches of the Federal Procurement Data System, the FPDS, there were a few contracts for equipment from Chinese companies that are now prohibited. I want to know more about those circumstances, and that discussion should probably happen between us in private at some point soon. But I have to say that the VA's answer gives me absolutely no confidence. FPDS is a public database that contains, at best, a scant amount of details about what was actually purchased. If the VA is relying on FPDS to know whether blacklisted Chinese IT equipment was bought, I don't believe anyone in the department knows what's really going on. Mr. Cunningham, my question is there a more authoritative record, or is FPDS truly what you're relying on?
So I stand behind the response that we provided to you. I'll be glad to have another opportunity to come talk to you specifically about these, about how we manage our assets, and in particular these blacklisted companies. As far as the response, we stand beside that as being the best way for us to provide the definitive answer to you.
Okay. That's good to hear, but can you tell me more about why did the VA's official response cite FPDS and no other sources of information?
Well, again, we were answering the question that you asked. Was there purchase of blacklisted companies inside VA? We used the source that was most relevant to us, and we feel we answered that question completely. Again, I'd be glad to come back and talk more in depth about our processes of asset acquisitions, as well as how we manage our assets.
Okay. Section 889 of the FY19 NDAA is coming into force in August. I strongly supported it in the Armed Services Committee, which I'm a member of as well. As I'm sure you know, it stops federal agencies from contracting with any entity that uses blacklisted telecom equipment or services. Is the VA prepared to comply with that law?
Yes, we are.
How does the VA know whether a company is using blacklisted equipment or services? And I want to point out that the law applies to existing contracts as well as contracts in the future.
It'll take some time to go back through our contracts and work with our third parties to identify where this has occurred. Like you, I believe that there is probably equipment being used by our third parties because it was not restricted at the time, and if they purchased it for use, we need to make sure that in contract language, it's prohibited and it's removed if it's on our contracts.
The HIPAA privacy rule was written before mobile apps and APIs existed. Do you think the HIPAA privacy rule is sufficient to stop technology companies from monetizing protected health information?
There's not a clear statement in HIPAA regarding that. I think there is opportunity for us to expand on HIPAA laws to include how electronic records are managed, stored, and then downstream support from third parties or subcontractors.
Does the VA individually or specifically have any role in stopping technology companies from monetizing veterans' health records, healthcare data?
So in contracts, and we kind of talked about this before, if in order for them to access our networks, they have to meet the same agreements and standards that VA has, and that VA's policy is not to sell or share information outside of the roles that they're designed to do. So in that case, if you're talking, do we have the technology to monitor the third parties? We do not. It's outside if it's outside that contract. If they do it, we can definitely look at doing a review and figuring out how we're going to remediate that, whether it's remove them from contract or hold them liable for losses.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I now recognize Mr. Rowe for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Data privacy is an important issue in the VA, and as the ranking member mentioned, especially with the data breach with Equifax, obviously became clear to most Americans it was a huge problem. And it's a problem throughout the entire healthcare and private sector, and I'm glad we're able to have this discussion. I've learned a lot already. However, I repeatedly ask that today's hearing be focused at least on part the electronic health record modernization and include a witness from that office. I am encouraged, and I appreciate the chair and I discussed before the hearing started that they're now going to have a meeting. We're going to have a meeting very soon, and I appreciate that. Bill and I we're in Seattle and Madigan recently, and then been to Spokane twice. To see the rollout, and there are issues there which we'll discuss later. Ranking Member Walls, my friend Ranking Member Walls, now Governor Walls, and I created this subcommittee with the intent of overseeing the EHR be the core of its responsibility. I now recognize that parties can change along with events, but even before Secretary Wilkie communicated his decision to delay the CERN implementation in Spokane, this was already a pivotal month in that project. And one of the delays that DOD incurred was security. That held up the DOD rollout. I expected us to be here out of the questioning VA about the Cerner deployment, what it was going to look like on March 28th, or about what the delay would entail. I firmly believe Secretary Wilkie's decision to delay was the right call. I also believe strongly that the committee now needs to ramp up, not ramp down its oversight of the project, and I look forward to that hearing, Madam Chair. I'm going to go over several things quickly. I was just looking, I appreciate the chairs putting up on the whiteboard here. This is disturbing to me. When you look at the app here, the PTSD coach, and I punch and allow, well, what I allow to happen when I punch the PTSD coach, which I may not know is access to my contacts in my phone and other, whatever that is, my storage. And along with the concussion coach, I give my calendar up, my contacts, photos, media, files, microphone, I mean, on and on. The PTSD coach has access to the mic on this. So I find that very disturbing, because you might inadvertently hit that and not know. And this disclaimer, obviously written by a horde of attorneys, nobody reads. And I think we've got to simplify this, and certainly I think a lot of people, including me, could make a mistake, and access to your entire phone could be here, and it could be your financial other information on here. I think we have to be very, very careful with that. and revised. I can't imagine why the PTSD coach needs access to my microphone or my contacts or my schedule. So anyway, that said, I think we need to rethink that out. Mr. Cunningham, the VA sent out a notice of privacy practices, which I have here, and in September, and it caused a lot of confusion with the veterans. I got a call when we were at Bill was pointing out when we were in Seattle about this from a constituent, and I'm sure many of our colleagues did too. Apparently, the notice was written in a confusing way, seemed to conflate VA's long-standing privacy practices under HIPAA with a change made by the Mission Act that allows information about drug and alcohol use, HIV, sickle cell anemia to be shared with community care providers unless the veteran opts out. Can you explain what the VA meant with that?
So
Here it is. It's a lengthy front and back 8-page. I just read it here just a minute ago, a good bit of it on here, and so I can see why a veteran was confused when they got this.
it's certainly not the intent to confuse veterans. It's intent to inform veterans. I'm sure it's gone through numerous reviews for readability, and if we miss the mark on that, we can go back and find another way as well to relay what we're trying to convey.
I guess probably a lot of people, Mr. Cameron, why did I get this? I think, and then when they read it, they thought, if you read on here, it's about your organ transplant, health care oversight, coroner, funeral services, national security workers, on and on. I guess a veteran would be asking, what in the world did I get this for?
Well, I think it's important that, for the Mission Act, it opened up new avenues for the veteran, and that we were trying to inform them on what that new avenues means and what information we were sharing in support of those new avenues and new capabilities. If we confuse them, my sincere apologies, and I'm glad to take it back and see if there's a better way for us to convey when we go and add new capabilities, new benefits, and share information with new venues, that we make sure that the veterans understand what we're doing on their behalf.
Yeah, my time's expired. I think we just sort of overwhelmed them with too much information. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Mr. Cunningham, along this point, with respect to the notification for veterans, you made the statement that veterans are not employees of the VA, so you don't have control. However, I do think that there is a trust relationship, that veterans understand that if there is something being promoted or endorsed or, endorsed by the VA, that there's a trust relationship there. So I do think that there's a higher level of accountability and responsibility to making sure that veterans understand in a clear, concise, easily understandable way. And what we're seeing again and again is it seems that we're getting caught up in all the legalese without this clear, like I would expect that if you download an app and you're about to release all of your contact information, that there's like a clear warning. You understand what you're doing here. And so I hope that we can look at that moving forward, because what's happening right now, and we're hearing from our veterans in the field, that there's, ultimately a lack of trust, especially when it comes to this incredibly sensitive information. Ms. Orr, I wanted to ask you, does the VA, and this goes back to the apps, primarily because when a veteran downloads their data into a third-party app, HIPAA no longer applies. And so I want to know, does the VA vet application apps before recommending them or putting them on the App Store? Or
So I would like to take a first glance at this. VA apps that are on the VA store have been reviewed by VA. We see them as a value to the veteran, and we look to make sure that that they're meeting our acceptable use policy. In most cases, they're attaching to an API that means that they're getting information from VA as part of that service to the veteran through that application. I'll ask
so
Ms. Orr.
what are the criteria for that app to pass this vetting process?
Well, we're looking at where's the benefit for the veteran. Again, if is it protected, is it accessing our networks, and does it meet those standards that we briefly talked about earlier? And then what's the intent of the company in providing that app? So if they're selling that information, obviously we would not endorse that sort of application. We do want veterans to look at those applications and know that VA is supporting those applications and reviewing them to get on that app.
So, are there any requirements in terms of the app security? Including access to the VA-controlled data? Like, what are the criteria for that?
So VA-controlled data, and we'll probably have to look at each app as it goes through, and we can come back and give you a more detailed decision process tree on apps. But in general, we're looking to make sure that if they're accessing personal information, personal identifiable information, or PHI, that they meet the same standards that we have, that they have to be protected, and they have to agree to that standard in order to access the API. As far as non-PII-related applications, for instance, there might be an application that says, where's the closest hospital, and we want to make sure that veterans clinics and hospitals are on that application, it's out for the public. That in itself is not reviewed that close, but we see the value of it for the veteran, and we'd hope that they would look at that as a service that we're providing them.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to having some more information along those lines. I just wanted to ask, so given what we've heard today and your processes, are there any areas of concern? Are there any areas, how can we be helpful? What can we do to help the VA to make sure that veterans' data is secure?
At this time, I don't think we're asking for any specific legislation or resources. Patience as we're trying to solve this bigger problem around this greater access of data. I thought this morning's comments were on mark and described the challenges that we have in this environment, especially as relate to how do we make the risk-based decision. If we go strictly by compliance and if zero tolerance is what we're going for, we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunity that technology brings and even life improvement opportunities if we're not being able to share information with our third parties that are trusted to the extent that we're trying to bring better value, better customer experience to the veteran. And that also includes security and privacy in that risk decision.
Thank you. Okay. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Banks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be quick. Mr. Cunningham, I want to read you part of the VA's terms of services for its API platform. Quote, when records regarding an individual are obtained through a VA API, you may not expose that content to other individual or third parties without specific, explicit consent from the individual or his or her authorized representative or as permitted by applicable law, end quote. Mr. Cunningham, is consent from the veteran always required or only required when there is not a law permitting the disclosure?
If it's in line with what, for the APIs, it would be that they would have to consent to that data unless it's provided by Veterans Affairs in regards that we've contracted with a third party to provide a specific app for for Veterans Affairs. So if it's a VA-built application, then we wouldn't ask necessarily in every case that the veteran would have to click to it. However, if it's outside of our management it would require the veteran to approve it.
What exactly does a third party mean here? And is it non-VA software? How about another API?
So if you're building an application and you're wanting to get data from an information source, in this case, the one that VA actually owns, you're going to be accessing an API. And I would have to bring some of our more experienced API developers in there to talk to you about that exchange. But in principle of that, before they can connect, they have to get approval between the VA and that third party that's requesting information. And in that case, third parties could be a separate organization outside of VA's purview.
So it sounds like VA's partner that is using the API is responsible for getting the consent from the veteran. What role does the VA have in making sure that happens correctly?
If it's on our application, our app store, we do verify that they're asking it. We do test the look and walk through it as if we're a veteran to ensure that's there. Other than that, if a third party is providing an app to a veteran and it's outside of VA's purview, we have no real control of validating whether they're asking for that consent or how they use that information in agreement with that veteran.
Okay, that's all I got. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairman of the committee, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. Mr. Cunningham, welcome. I recognize you're from the Office of OIT, and but since you're the one from VA before us today, I'd like to echo what Chairwoman Lee said earlier about the VA needing to be more transparent with us. It's very important that that as we continue to move forward through the integration process, that VA is as transparent as, not just as possible, just plain transparent. Here's the thing. I was told last week by Secretary Wilkie that everything was on track with the electronic health record modernization rollout. But yet on Monday, I'm told that the go-live was going to be postponed with no definitive timeline about how long it will be delayed. So, just with that as a sort of preface, what does VA need to get things back on track? Is there anything that you need?
As far as EHRM and Cerner, that's outside of my purview, from my understanding, that we have what we need. We're partnered with DOD. We're sharing information. And the decision to delay was a more tactical one and not necessarily a resource limiting issue.
Okay, I realize that you're not the point here, but if you could take back to the department, I want to know when you and others were first made aware that the EHRM go-live would be delayed. You have to answer that. If you know now, please, if you yourself can answer that question, but I just want to know when this became apparent, because last week the Secretary himself said this was all moving forward. Didn't anticipate any issues.
I'll be glad to take that back. Personally, myself, I was aware of it yesterday.
You became aware of it yesterday?
That's
okay.
correct.
All right, thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Watkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cunningham, I want to ask about VA's partnership with Apple Health. My understanding is iPhones have memory chips that are physically separate for different kinds of information. How does that work in practice, and what cybersecurity protections does that provide?
So I'm not an Apple engineer, and I think that might be outside my scope of experience. I would say that on premise, on theory, Having a separate chip that manages data from the Apple applications themselves is a wise and in design.
Apple says it does not control any of its users' data that it transmits on its iPhone. When the company says that, it seems to be referring to third-party apps. In other words, the iPhone is just a vessel for other apps. But Apple Health is actually one of the few apps that the company directly owns. What privacy protections specific to the VA are in place when veterans access VA medical records on Apple Health?
For Apple Health, like any other third party that's accessing veterans' information, would have to meet the same standards for privacy and HIPAA.
Your testimony discusses a privacy threshold analysis, which is a tool the VA uses to ID privacy issues in new IT or systems or projects. Can you explain what this is, how it works, and give some examples of privacy issues that you've identified in the past and how you've resolved them?
So NIST has a set of controls as it relates to privacy as well as cybersecurity. Those controls are part of the system development and their system security plans. They're assessed in development as well as in operations and provided to the authorizing official to make a determination on whether the system meets the standards and what the associated risks, if not meeting the standards, through either mitigating controls or possible POA&Ms or plan of actions milestones to resolve them. How it works and some additional information, I'll ask Ms. David if she would like to answer that.
Sure. Yes, the privacy threshold analysis is actually the vehicle for assessing systems, programs, operations for privacy impacts. So it's a templated document that goes through the life cycle of the effort itself and discusses, for example, privacy risks, those risk mitigations, any other connected systems, basically any and everything having to do with point in time activity and then as the effort develops. So it's a living document that gets revisited throughout the life cycle of the effort, and it also takes into considerations records retention, uses, and things of that such.
Understood, Ms. David. What are your specific privacy concerns?
Generally, the privacy concerns would be, how information is being shared. Is it being shared in accordance with routine uses, which are outlined in, for example, a system of record notice? The privacy concerns would also be how the information, based on its level of sensitivity, how it's being protected, so that the protections are commensurate with the sensitivity of the information, and then also how information is handled in, for example, the incidence of a potential breach. And so we talk about that as well.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Rowe for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just to show you some of the confusion very quickly, Mr. Cunningham, I was reading right, when we offer you the opportunity to decline the use or disclosure of your health information, patient directories, unless you opt out of the VA Medical Center patient directory when being admitted to a VA healthcare facility, we may list your general condition, religious affiliation, and the location of where you're receiving care. This information may be disclosed to people who ask for you by name. Your religious affiliation will only be disclosed to members of the clergy who ask for you by name. Note, if you do object to being listed in the patient directory, no information will be given out about you unless there is other legal authority. This means your family and friends will not be able to find what room you're in while you're in the hospital. It also means you will not be able to receive flowers or mail, including federal benefits checks, while you're an inpatient in the hospital or nursing home. All flowers and mail will be returned to the sender. So that means if somebody thinks they're not going to get paid, they're always going to opt in. So I think those are the kind of things I think that cause some confusion with veterans. my suggestion is, Madam Chair, don't opt into anything. That would be my, after listening to this. And maybe go back to carrier pigeons, because you don't have any privacy anymore. There is no such thing as privacy. And I, as a physician, I got, this is years ago, because of access insurance companies had to very sensitive information. I would sometimes even limit what I put in a medical record, because I was afraid even then, before the access that the hackers and all the people have, and with these opt-ins, you've just opened the book on your life. I mean, I as an OBGYN doctor, I got told some very private things, which I just had to leave between my ears because I was concerned with the privacy. And that leads to my question. How does the VA decide which technology company it'll collaborate with, and are there particular companies that the VA would be uncomfortable with, or what specific privacy practices the department consider a red flag? Because we know that the Chinese, we know this, the PLA is always looking for a back door into somewhere, which may lead to someplace else. So how do you guys make that decision?
Well, I think, one, we have to balance the availability and access. I mean, certainly there's many veterans that benefit from the applications and the APIs that are being provided today.
Yep.
Quicker information. How we figure out who we work with, we do not have a blacklist of companies. We don't pick winners and losers in the market. We have an API that provides information when it's requested in the proper protocol. So in there, we're verifying that the proper protocol is there. I mean, obviously, if there's a known, I don't think there's a litmus test for what organizations are in or out. Certainly, we can talk a little bit more and go back for the record and provide more detail on, what is the decision tree that we use in connecting with APIs. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think,
Aaron.
obviously, these apps bring a lot of advantages to people. I use them, we all do, that you can find a restaurant or gas, whatever you may be using it for. I got that. The question is that's an advantage. I look at a risk-benefit ratio. What are the risks you take? How can this information, I think both the chair and the ranking member have asked this question, how is this information shared? Is it accessible? How can it be used? Is it sold? I mean, you know, when you purchase something on Amazon, I like to backpack. Well, I'll have 4 tents on here today that Amazon's trying to sell me. So those are questions that I guess we as a society need to answer, and is VA protecting it, really looking at who you partner with?
We are looking at who we partner with. We look at who has connections to our APIs, what they plan on using that information for. They have to sign an acceptable use agreement, and we police when we find out that there's information that's being wrongly used. We police appropriately. With that said, what information are we talking about? If we're talking about healthcare information, obviously there's a higher standard of security that goes along with it. If you're talking about access to files, pictures, calendars on your phone, most users probably have, I'm just estimating, probably 30 or 40 applications on their phone at any given time. And they also carry 2 phones. How many of those applications are also providing that same sort of data and access to the information that they reside on their phone?
My time's up. I didn't say we were smart. I'm just
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today. I'd now like to, you're excused, and I will call up the second panel. Thank you. We can take a brief recess while we set that up. Thank you. I'll now call this back to order, and I'd like to introduce the witnesses on our second panel. Nick Culbertson is CEO and co-founder of Protennis, is that right? Protennis, and is an Army veteran. Tina Olson-Grand is the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Healthcare Leadership Council and Chair of the Confidentiality Coalition. Ramsey Solomon is the Associate Director, National Legislative Service for Veterans of Foreign Wars, and is a Marine Corps veteran. And Harold Wolf is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society, HIMSS. We will now hear the prepared statement from our panel members. Your written statements in full will be included in the hearing record. Without objection, Mr. Culbertson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. You can put your volume, yep, thank you.
There, does that work? Great. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity to present. I'm here today under 3 purposes. I'm a former, as you mentioned, former non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. I was also treated as part of the Veterans Affairs, and then I sit here now as an entrepreneur and CEO of Protennis, which specializes in health data security. I think the data privacy is in constant juxtaposition with data sharing. We've heard much of that throughout testimony today, and I think it's really important that this issue be addressed. You know, our research has shown that every year data breaches have increased. You know, just last year alone, 41 million medical records were breached in the United States, and that's only what we know about or what's been discovered. And so the more we share data, the more of a threat we create to our patients' data, particularly our veterans' data. I've had experience with both the limitations of data being a challenge, but also seeing how the data sharing creates more of a challenge. So my story goes back to when I was last stationed in Afghanistan. I was assigned to use this device called the MC4 that was supposed to take patient data from combat casualties that I could wirelessly send to a flight medic that would then transfer that information all the way back to retirement and VA. And it was a seamless integrated network that data would persist through VA, from DoD all the way to VA. Unfortunately, we got trained like many hours on this device, and then we took it into the field and found out it didn't work. We had to manually rewrite the notes, the medical notes, to our flight medics and pass it off in pieces of paper that would fly away in the wind. I think that program is still being developed. You know, I hope that it continues to persist. After I got out of the military, I sought treatment through VA for my wrist that I fractured in the military. I was a little bit shocked to hear from my VA physician that since my wrist had healed and there was no x-ray in my record, my wrist was never broken in the first place. And so I couldn't get my document updated to show that I had broken my wrist and make sure that I had long-term care for that. So I had to seek physical therapy through private practice, through private insurance, which is unfortunate. On the other side of things, I've seen how health data becoming more accessible and shared creates more of a risk and more of a concern. As a medical student at Johns Hopkins, I saw how Hopkins rolled out the Epic integration, similar to what VA is doing now with Cerner on a different scale. You know, decades ago, the only person who had access to your medical record was the physician at the foot of your bed, and now anyone throughout the hospital system, any business associate, any partner health system, any other Epic clients can now access that data. And so technology has created this great increase in access that helps improve patient care and outcomes, but at the same time drastically increases the risk. I think that you know, my belief is that while technology has created greater access, there's an opportunity to create better assurance and better privacy with technology alone. I don't think this can be addressed just through policy and regulation. I think that we need to have security devices put in place, specifically with the VA as well. Our company developed an artificial intelligence that understands how any end user is accessing PHI and whether they're using it appropriately. And we send proactive alerts to privacy risk compliance officers that identify those threats so that they can deal with them in relative real time, proactively, rather than waiting for something to happen. I know that this is an incredibly needed technology because of the amount of violations that we find. We estimate that 1 in 300 workforce members in healthcare violates privacy per month. And unless a monitoring solution is put in place, or unless regulations are appropriately addressed or policies are put in place, that only will continue and get worse. So I thank you all for taking the time to address this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Culbertson. I now recognize Ms. Gran.
Thank you. Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and members of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, Subcommittee on Technology and Modernization, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tina Grandy. I am Executive Vice President of Policy for the Healthcare Leadership Council and Chair of HLC's Confidentiality Coalition. HLC is an association of chief executives representing all disciplines within American healthcare. And the Confidentiality Coalition advocates for policies and practices that safeguard the privacy of patients and healthcare consumers while enabling the essential flow of patient information. The subcommittee's examination of how the Department of Veterans Affairs manages veterans' health data is especially timely as new technologies continue to be introduced to the market. For every promising health information technological development, there is a risk of its misuse. There is a glaring oddity in our current health data regulatory scheme that certain health data is subject to robust federal privacy protections, while other health data is not. As long as this disparate treatment exists, the challenges faced by an organization such as the VA to harness new technological innovations while maintaining the privacy and security of data will remain formidable. Any approach to health data privacy should preserve the existing HIPAA framework, which applies to treatment, payment, and healthcare operations for all patients, including veterans. And new legislation should apply only to health data not governed by HIPAA. New innovations, while beneficial, have resulted in more and more health data falling outside the protections of HIPAA. This will be the case when the technology or services are not offered by or on behalf of a HIPAA-covered entity, but rather by developers or technology companies directly to the consumer. For example, a consumer may download a third-party health app to their smartphone that sends a summary report to their doctor. As long as the doctor did not hire the app developer to provide its services to patients, the data in the app is not protected by HIPAA, even if the app is recommended by the patient's doctor. Under HIPAA, covered entities are required to provide individuals with a notice that describes the entity's privacy practices, the purposes for which it uses and discloses protected health information, or PHI, and the individual's privacy rights and how to exercise those rights. This transparency is an important protection that is particularly relevant as businesses seek to monetize health data. At the same time, the HIPAA framework recognizes that health information is not a commodity, the flow of which is determined by the highest bidder. Great care was taken when establishing the HIPAA framework to balance various competing interests. This same approach should be taken in addressing non-HIPAA health data. Any new privacy framework should be consistent with HIPAA definitions. Conflicting or inconsistent terminology could have unintended consequences that could seriously and adversely impact the ability of healthcare organizations to aggregate and share health data for important care delivery and population health purposes. Equally important, security safeguards should be commensurate with the safeguards required by the HIPAA security rule. Robust security requirements for non-HIPAA health data are critical not only for sophisticated businesses that collect vast amounts of data, but also for startups developing new products and services, which should be incorporating security by design practices in their product development process. The promise of interoperability is another reason to ensure harmonization between laws governing PHI and non-HIPAA health data, and to have national standards for health information privacy and security. Interoperability cannot come to fruition if these organizations are subject to and constrained by different standards that do not align or potentially even conflict with one another. This is particularly critical for veterans who may seek care in community health systems in addition to the VA health system. We believe it is essential to replace the current mosaic of sometimes conflicting state privacy laws, rules, and guidelines with strong, comprehensive national standards. In closing, HLC and the Confidentiality Coalition commend the subcommittee for seeking to address the challenges faced by the VA in managing veterans' health data. We believe a balanced approach, compatible with and modeled upon the existing HIPAA framework, and that provides protections for non-HIPAA health data similar to that provided for PHI under HIPAA, is the best way to address these challenges and provide a comprehensive, consistent, and transparent health information privacy framework for the health data of those in service and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grandy. I now recognize Mr. Suleiman.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the men and women of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and its auxiliary, thank you for the opportunity to address our members' concerns about data privacy and portability and VA's responsibility to protect veterans' privacy. The commercialization of data crept up on Americans and pounced like a tiger. You've covered the data breaches that revealed information and vulnerabilities in systems and institutions we presumed were secure. Healthcare data breaches often occur through malicious attacks as well as non-malicious errors such as the loss of a laptop. Rarely do we focus on self-disclosed and user-generated data, which accounts for a staggering amount of information on the average American. One's Facebook profile, Instagram picture, Spotify playlist, supermarket discount card, Fitbit data, pictures taken by a Ring door cam, internet service provider data, yes, that the one site that your friend told you about that you looked at just for a second, just that one time. All of that information is available unbrokered. Companies scrape the internet for more photos and information on people who have no idea that this is happening and certainly never consented. And you've covered earlier the permissions that veterans are required to consent to use VA apps. Veterans live in this information and technology ecosystem, and the same concerns apply. However, because veterans have access to a comprehensive suite of services from the VA, everything from health care to home loans, veteran-sensitive information is concentrated in one location, the Department of Veterans Affairs. The requirement to consent to terms that are broad, rarely understood, and without alternative is a major concern. Changes in ambitious products at VA, the integration of health records with DoD, the Million Veteran Project, Mission Act implementation, present great opportunities but data security challenges. VA partners with entities outside its IT ecosystem, and this seam is where vulnerabilities also lie. Veterans expect VA to set the tone and place data security and privacy as a foundational priority. You've already touched on past breaches and security lapses, such as the 2006 theft of a VA laptop that exposed the data of 26.5 million veterans in active duty military. 2015 OIG report detailed Chinese nationals accessing the VA network from China. An October 2019 OIG report detailed security lapses, including placing veterans' PHI and PII, their personally identifiable information and personal health information, on thumb drives and personal computers. And the 2019 OIG report on VA's ability to meet the Federal Information Security Modernization Act requirements noted significant challenges. This leads us to believe that data security management and protocols may not be at the level necessary. VA's transfer of information to entities outside its ecosystem through record sharing and simple IT processes like the single VA logon through ID.me are of concern. As noted in our written testimony, end-user license agreements leave questions of access to and retention of veterans' information open. You also touched on that earlier in your questions and comments. It's not a question of understanding the terms, it's a question of what are the alternatives, and most often there are none. We also noted the instance of Ascension's partnership with Google on a massive health data project known as Project Nightingale, where Google collected sensitive health data as a HIPAA-compliant business partner of the health system without the explicit opt-in of patients. As Ascension often marketed towards veterans and encouraged them to use Ascension with the Veterans Choice Program, it is unclear whether veteran medical records shared with Ascension as part of community care programs ended up in Google's hands. Let me be clear that just because I use an iPhone SE still doesn't make me a Luddite or a conspiracy theorist. I just really like small phones. Great good can come from data sharing, especially health data, and VA is in a very unique position. Access to healthcare data means that providers can apply artificial intelligence and machine learning to make diagnoses faster and better, as well as treat more effectively. Nick testified to the artificial intelligence capabilities of his platform. The trove of veterans' de-identified health data offers game-changing research possibilities, and these worthy goals must be pursued. To Dr. Rowe's point about risk versus benefit, though, the VFW believes in these foundational priorities. The use of veterans' information should require informed consent and a plain language explanation of exactly what the veteran is consenting to, what will be used and collected, and how that data may be used. VFW and other VSOs are more than willing to consult with VA on making VA communications easily understandable to veterans. Our Executive Director, B.J. Lawrence, has directly offered that assistance, and the offer stands. The VFW also believes that the minimum amount of veteran data should be collected through VA platforms, including by third-party partners. VA and contractors should not pass on any more information than is necessary to their subcontractors or partners. Information should be retained for the minimum amount of time necessary and then deleted, and veteran information should be de-identified where possible. I thank you for your attention to this important matter and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Suleiman. I now recognize Mr. Wolf for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Hal Wolf. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society, HIMSS. HIMSS is a global nonprofit advisor and thought leader supporting the transformation of the health ecosystem through information and technology, with a membership that includes more than 80,000 individuals and hundreds of partners and organizations. We appreciate the committee holding today's hearings and addressing the role of Congress and the Department of Veteran Affairs in ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, security, interoperability, and availability of veterans' personal data. As significant advances in technological innovation in healthcare have allowed us to capture data and use information in unprecedented ways, we must ensure that proper processes are in place to protect the privacy and the security of the patient's most sensitive information without losing the potential benefit of its use. Our healthcare ecosystem has come to rely on an increasing number of tools and capabilities which depend upon secure access to and use of patient data. The industry's fundamental goal is improved outcomes at a lower cost per episode. To meet this goal, we must have technology-enabled data collection and interoperable data sharing. Given the large population receiving services through the Department of Veterans Affairs healthcare system, it's not a stretch to see that the VA is facing the same pressures as the rest of the industry to use data-driven capabilities to help them better manage the health and the health care of their patient population. We believe that recently proposed federal regulations, including the CMS interoperability and patient access rule and ONC information blocking rules, will advance interoperability and support safe and secure access to health information and data-driven tools that allow for more provider and consumer choice in care and in treatment. Now, any discussion around access to patients' health data inevitably leads to questions around who owns the data, who can access the data, what can be done with the data once it's granted, and what are the stewardship responsibilities over the data. It's imperative that our mindset shifts to the access and the appropriate usage of data that is needed or information that benefits patient or individual health outcomes. Generally speaking, Data ownership refers to the entity or individual who owns or originates the data. However, the data may not be in the originator's possession when needed or having already been passed on. Most decision support tools, for example, use data from multiple entities that may begin to use more than just clinical data, such as social determinant information, to make recommendations to the user. Data access simply refers to being granted permission of the data in some way or possession. This might include the ability to read, edit, or copy data for a variety of purposes. It's data usage and how the data can be transformed into information, storage of the data, its permission for primary and secondary use, both short and long term. Rules around primary and secondary usage of data are where significant attention needs to be focused. Data stewardship largely focuses on providing a secure and trackable environment. Cybersecurity is an important component of data stewardship. In order to ensure both veterans and broader patient populations receive the best possible care, providers, patients, and caregivers must be able to access the right information at the right time. Access rights with clear usage guidelines are mission critical. HIPAA remains an integral part of our nation's information security and privacy infrastructure for both veterans and the broader patient populations. With regard to the public dialogue on possible HIPAA changes, HIMSS is focused on encouraging the safe portability of data. I would like to thank Chairwoman Lee and Ranking Member Banks for this opportunity to testify today, and all members of the subcommittee for prioritizing such a critical issue. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Wolf, given when we talk about data management, data privacy, what should we really be looking at, and how should the VA measure its success regarding patient protection?
Wonderfully complex question, and I think we hit on a number of the challenges earlier. The initial point of data protection is the data that you have stewardship over at that particular moment and how you must protect it, but more importantly, how you use it in the care treatment and the pathways to ensure that the best possible treatment and recommendations are happening to the individual patient, and we're getting the best recommendations to the clinicians that are there. So we have to be able to look at that multi-tiered safeguard that was already been brought forward. Am I storing the information that I have possession of at that time with all the appropriate safeguards? To whomever I am passing that information, we need to know their security on their side and where that information can and cannot go. The points about secondary use of information or its potential sale, those are huge issues. And they really need to be legislated on a full-scale basis. The VA can do what it should be doing in terms of the protecting the information, but it also becomes an important congressional piece.
And how should the VA measure its success?
I think you measure your success, first of all, by are there any breaches that are occurring? That's the simple part of it. The second is measuring its success in its review of secondary apps or organizations that the information is passed to. And then, of course, in the end, how is that information being used to better the treatment of the patients that it has accountability for? And that relies on understanding the use of the applications and how it's transmitted and whether there's success protocols on value-based care being delivered.
Great, thank you. Ms. Grandy and Mr. Suleiman, could you please give me an example of, in your experience in mind, what a worst-case scenario would be with respect to how the VA treats its patients' data?
Sure. A worst-case scenario we could consider, I think there could be many, I think largely falls outside of the non-HIPAA covered data that is identifiable, it's sensitive, it's related to detailed healthcare information that an organization who is not bound by HIPAA or strict state privacy laws either sells, monetizes, or mishandles information that the patient or consumer has no knowledge of because there's simply they're not aware that their information is not protected, because consumers generally don't distinguish between, I'm at a place where I've got HIPAA coverage and we just know we have our health information. And we have trusted hospitals and health plans and pharmacies with our information because largely HIPAA's worked pretty well. So I think a terrible scenario would be information that's sensitive about our healthcare has been bought, sold, used, analyzed without our knowledge and has trickled downstream for a number of years and comes back to potentially discriminate against us in the long run. I think that's a real risk that's occurring in a largely unregulated market that has access to identifiable information about us.
Thank you.
I would tend to agree with Ms. Grandy on that point. I mean, I think that HIPAA provides a framework, and it provides penalties, and it provides some clear guidance on what is and what is not acceptable. But as I mentioned in my testimony, and both the written and the oral, the user-generated data that we have, I mean, the information that's collected off of the apps that you were talking about, and with the privacy policies and in written by committees of lawyers, is hordes of lawyers, I think is how Dr. Rowe referred to it, having that information leak out, and then the being collated with other information that's out there. I mean, I think that is really the danger just writ large across the entire for the entire population, but for veterans especially, if you're talking about TBI, PTSD, other sensitive information, having those sorts of that sort of health information be able to be gleaned from the purchases that you make through a doctor's use of the Zelf platform, for instance, that you bought compression socks and syringes, and, so a machine looks at that and says, oh, a diabetic, that sort of amalgamation of information that you didn't even know was out there is not covered by HIPAA, is the main danger.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Banks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for anyone who wants to answer it. Do you believe the HIPAA privacy rules the rule is adequate to govern apps that receive patients' protected health information?
I'm happy to start. I think that's a very complex question. The HIPAA privacy rule was promulgated many years ago. It was crafted very meticulously for a healthcare caregiving and payment system. And as such, it was applied very specifically to that type of system that is directly in contact with patients, their payment, their claims. When we're looking at HIPAA as a potential framework for tech companies who don't necessarily fit into the very precise definitions for a covered entity, and may not be functioning as a business associate because they're not working directly for a covered entity, maybe sandwiching those companies into HIPAA as a new covered entity, it's very complicated, and I don't think it's going to be easy at all. You could look at potentially a larger national privacy framework that would apply to those companies, but our recommendation is that when it comes to health information, that it harmonize with HIPAA. The last thing we want to do is to bottleneck important health information because it stops because you've got two different privacy laws that are in play that could conflict or be confusing. So if, for example, the Veterans Affairs Committee is considering new privacy legislation as it relates to veterans' health information and non-HIPAA covered data, we would suggest that you also work with other committees of jurisdiction that are overseeing the commercial and Medicare and Medicaid markets so that as veterans flow in and out of the commercial and the VA system, their information isn't getting bottlenecked because you've got two separate privacy laws at play.
Okay, let me move on to another question, and this is for anyone who wants to answer it as well. If you agree that Apple and Google essentially control software distribution through their app stores, What is their responsibility to police the apps they allow into their stores, not only for cybersecurity, but also for privacy protection?
I'll take a stab at this first. I think that if you walked into a brick and mortar store and, you know, a product lopped your hand off when you went and grabbed for it, you'd agree that the store is probably responsible for being negligent in offering that. So I think that by and large, the tech sector's abdication of responsibility for the products that they carry on in their virtual stores is something that really needs to be looked at and addressed. I mean, if you are carrying something that is a purveyor of malicious software, or you know, yesterday there was a report about 3 email clients that scrape data off phones just by virtue of loading them and consenting through the data and privacy policy, the thing that you don't read and click accept. You know, one of them scraped the data and sent it back to Rakuten, one of the, you know, an online shopping platform, you know, and literally same sort of consent that you have with some of these apps, you know, your microphone, your contacts, your pictures, literally anything and everything that they want. Now, the response was, oh, we only collect certain things, but again, it's not transparent. So I think having the transparency and having the accountability, there needs to be some verification system that what you're downloading through a trusted platform is indeed trusted.
I'll move on to another question. Or anybody else? Yeah.
Could I just add on to that, that I think health data should, like, we could take it a step further, that really shouldn't be compared to other types of data that you might find on an iPhone, just because of how valuable it is and how immutable it is. So just because we say something is appropriate or suitable for an iPhone app, I think we should even go beyond that for health data.
Very good. I don't have a lot of time left, so I'll yield back and save questions for later.
Thank you. This question's for Mr. Culbertson. How should the VA compare to private industry in areas of data privacy, consumer protection, and security?
Well, I think if we ask that question today and we look at the top 5 offenders of HIPAA violation according to the Office of Civil Rights, VA ranks among those top 5. I think with this opportunity to modernize technology, I think there's an opportunity to correct that image. I know that what health systems outside of the VA are doing now, back to the question you asked for Mr. Wolf in terms of demonstrating a good privacy program, is not only are we looking at whether good policies are in place, do we have a business associate for every partnership, are we ensuring appropriate transfer of data according to HIPAA and other regulations? But health systems are also auditing proactively every access and accounting for all of those disclosures to ensure that they are being appropriately used under treatment and payment operations. And so I think there's an opportunity here to, match that higher level of standard and additionally go beyond.
Thank you. Mr. Suleiman, should the VA be responsible for educating veterans on protecting their privacy?
I think that's a great question, ma'am, and I think that the obvious answer is yes. You know, particularly as it relates to any data that the VA is using or has in their possession. I mean, if you're talking about just, you know, general education, I mean, I think it'd be helpful and certainly falls within the VA's purview on many of the programs that it manages, but certainly for IT and healthcare data, that, as we said, the plain language explanation of what is being collected, how it's being used, what will be done with it, and any opt-in or opt-out options are something that the VA should clearly define. And as I said, you know, we're happy to help the VA review that process for readability and understandability for your average veteran.
Thank you. Ms. Grandy and or Mr. Wolf, how far should that VA obligation to protect data extend?
we'll take a pass. I think that coming back to this issue about the VA and the consistency of its needs in protecting the data has to be consistent with all of the other health systems that exist in the U.S. The harmonization point around HIPAA is a critical point as well. You do not want to create bifurcated environments. And the reality is, of course, is that a person who's receiving care through the VA may well be also receiving care from other entities. And so the free passage of that information is critical for their own health as well as future use of information. But the simple point is that the VA has to be extraordinarily vigilant, as does every healthcare system, on the use of that information and where it goes. Not just within its domain, but when it is passed, you have a responsibility to pass it to a quality organization. And so the testing and the variability, if you would, of the application that's receiving falls to the responsibility of the VA, as it should with every health system.
I agree completely. The VA does have a responsibility for those it oversees, as you know, as it relates to their health information and how it's being used. I think consumers just simply don't distinguish between information that's protected by their hospitals, health plans, pharmacies, and that which is not. And I think there's got to be more of an education just nationwide for consumers about how their information is protected and not, and the ramifications of it if it's not.
Yeah, I would just tag on in our last 30 seconds that it's very important for establishing criteria, if you would, around where that information is going to go and how it's going to be used. There is a baseline assumption on the part of every consumer that they are protected. And even if they are looking at these incredibly long agreements, their underlying assumption is that their information is under proper stewardship.
Concur.
I agree. I actually believe that veterans even have a higher level of expectation when it comes to the VA as well. I'm going to recognize Mr. Banks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Grand, is HIPAA's minimum necessary principle in tension with the 21st Century Cures Act penalties for information blocking?
Well, I know that the Office for Civil Rights sort of hinted around that in their HIPAA RFI that came out last fall. And we certainly will be commenting on that when the notice of proposed rulemaking comes out in short time. Our member organizations do believe that the minimum necessary standard is appropriate, that sharing only what's necessary to promote better health outcomes is the right way to manage health information. So, for example, in some of these scenarios where you've got to hand over your photos, your calendar, your contacts, that flies way beyond the minimum necessary standard under HIPAA. And I think our member organizations have all agreed that that's way too much information to be sharing. That said, though, there is value in analyzing large data sets to find treatments and cures. And that is one of the wonderful aspects of advances in technology, so we can speed up treatments and cures. I think motive matters, and really focusing on the motives behind what's trying to be done needs to be paid a lot of attention to.
Okay, let me move on. So far, our HIPAA conversation has been mostly about covered entities, business associates that happen to be technology companies or apps. In your testimony, Ms. Grand, you highlight the lack of legal protections when patients opt to provide their health data to an app. Should HIPAA or something very similar be extended to these apps, or should it be something different?
Well, the FTC does have some authority in the non-HIPAA space, so it's not that there's no legal protection, but I think many feel that the FTC's limited authority is a problem, and that the FTC should have more authority over the non-HIPAA space. In terms of legal protections in the non-HIPAA space, we do believe that regulation is necessary, that the information blocking rule out of ONC and the interoperability rule out of CMS, both of which we very clearly support the move towards interoperability. It is necessary and imperative to improve health outcomes. At the same time, there are provisions in those two rules that require health plans and providers to direct protected health information under HIPAA into an API and third-party app of a patient's choice. And that does get back to the fact that people don't distinguish what's under HIPAA and what's not. And if there's any way we could look at some kind of authority within those agencies where we could do a better job, perhaps some sort of a certification process or something whereby you have at least a semblance of good data stewardship going on with these third-party apps, we would recommend that. But we do believe that there is a role for Congress in this place to ensure that penalties and enforcement that are meaningful are brought to the forefront.
Let me finish with this final question for you, Ms. Grand. What are some specific privacy considerations for the medical device industry, especially concerning medical devices that are integrated with apps?
So if a medical device is not operating as a business associate, and many of them do, so therefore come under HIPAA, they are really working closely with doctors, hospitals, those that are in the HIPAA environment. And I think, again, it gets to the point that while we do support regulation outside of HIPAA, but in this particular case, it's especially important to note that it really needs to harmonize so that you're not creating a new barrier to information flow that really matters for, a beating heart, an insulin pump, things that are maybe tacked on through an app or something that helps support that may not be within the purview of a covered entity and therefore a business associate relationship. It's got to harmonize. You don't want to.
And terribly close to the FDA.
Yeah, and then you've got the
components on the
FDA is really
definitions as
starting to
well.
look at some of this now too, right?
Could I just add on that one complication here is that data that it may exist within the app that's not covered under the covered entity, once it touches data that came from that covered entity, then falls in that purview. And I think that's a nuance that a lot of app providers don't really take into consideration.
And if I could just take 20 seconds to echo the comments that both you and the chairwoman made earlier. HIPAA was created in an era when it was paper records, when analyzing data sets was extremely difficult, when my Mac LC3 with 80 megabytes was really impressive. And so it really hasn't taken into, it wasn't created and didn't take into account the environment that we're in now. So the harmonization of HIPAA and not blocking the flow of information and allowing all the good things that can happen with the analysis of big data sets and artificial intelligence and machine learning to healthcare issues is very important. But we also need to remember that, this was created 23 years ago in an entirely different world that wasn't foreseen at the time. Amazon was still just a bookseller that everybody thought was going to fail.
Thank you. Thank you. We are now going to adjourn. I wanted to thank all of the panelists for being here. Thank you, Ranking Member. What do I have to say here? Where's my statement? Hold on. There's something I need to say. First of all, thank you at the VA for sticking around for this testimony, and I certainly think there is a space for us to continue to look at this issue, especially as technology is accelerating, and making sure that we're looking out for innovation and patient results and care results, but also taking into effect protecting our veterans from what could potentially down the road be used for workforce discrimination, all sorts of things that could happen that would have an incredibly negative impact, not just on the health care of our veterans, but on their entire life and employment, et cetera. So I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation as this subcommittee continues oversight of the VA's innovation or technology modernization efforts. All members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material, and this hearing is now adjourned.